For 9 years, ECW was a wrestling promotion of many identities. It was the independent organization that created a playbook for other ambitious indies to follow. It was the rising revolution that captivated the minds and hearts of fans in their Philadelphia base and gradually beyond that perimeter. And more than any other deceased pro wrestling entity, it is the one whose innovations and tenets continue to be the most felt throughout the modern wrestling landscape in promotions all over the world. ECW has a polarizing history and legacy. Its proudest stars and fans contribute to a colorful hagiography decades after its demise, while disgruntled wrestlers and less impressed critics will note ECW's many shortcomings. However, ECW's influence cannot be denied. Pro wrestling, in whatever year you watch this video, would be radically different if not for the influence of the so-termed little promotion that took the world by storm, beaming out its brashness from a converted warehouse in South Philadelphia. From birth to death and through a long afterlife, ECW remains an enduring force in pro wrestling. This is the complete history of ECW. Before we begin, huge thanks to Nord for sponsoring this documentary. We here at Cultaholic truly believe it to be the best service of its kind. How do I use Nord? Well, obviously, I live in the United Kingdom. That limits me to just British streaming services, right? Wrong. With NordVPN, I can choose to be anywhere in the world I please, allowing me to access a whole host of free platforms, services, and content exclusive to any region I want. But it gets better. I could set myself to another region in the world and sign up for a certain premium sports entertainment service for a fraction of the price. Or, if I lived in the United States, I could sign up for that same service even though it doesn't exist as it once did in the USA before. So I could be getting all the premium live events, weekly shows, the vault of classic content, and the biggest library of wrestling documentaries anywhere on the web, while easing the burden on my wallet all at once. Oh, and it works for plenty of other premium subscription services too, if you catch my drift. If you get really smart with it, you don't just have to stop at streaming services either. Fancy some cheaper flights to Mania next year? Nord's got your back. And if all that wasn't enough, it protects against password attacks, phishing, ransomware, malware, and so much more. I don't do anything without a VPN these days, and if you're smart about it, it'll pay for itself in no time. There's even a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you sign up and decide Nord's not for you, you can get your money back with zero hassle. So grab our exclusive NordVPN deal by going to nordvpn.com/cultaholic, link in the description below, to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan, plus 4 additional months free. Before there was ECW, there was a promotion called the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance, or TWA, founded in 1989 by businessman and longtime fan Joel Goodhart. Goodhart drew upon his time running a wrestling merchandise business in the mid-80s to found TWA, which was designed to be an alternative for older fans that had grown weary of the cartoon-like offerings of Vince McMahon's WWF and the Jim Herd-helmed WCW. Running infrequently in the Philadelphia area, Goodhart booked what amounted to independent supercards, hosting names like Bam Bam Bigelow, Jerry Lawler, Paul Orndorff, and Eddie Gilbert, among many others. Goodhart's big-name-laden, gimmick-match-filled events were held quarterly, and became the talk of newsletters and the old APTA magazines. But the problem was, TWA wasn't making any money, due to a total lack of revenue streams and Goodhart's brazenness when it came to spending money. By early 1992, Goodhart abruptly cancelled an upcoming event and announced the immediate closure of Tri-State. He later claimed that he'd lost around $130,000 funding the promotion, most of which was his own money. In the near immediate fallout of TWA's demise, one of Goodhart's confidants and staffers stepped in to pick up the pieces. Like Goodhart, fellow businessman Tod Gordon envisioned a wrestling promotion that catered to a more adult clientele. However, he saw the folly of Goodhart's reckless spending and knew that for a promotion to survive long-term, it would require a more frugal approach. For however long, this company would have to rely on cheap local talent, while only resorting to bigger names if they didn't break the purse strings. With these basic guidelines in place, Gordon formally founded ECW, though at the time, ECW stood for Eastern Championship Wrestling. The first ever ECW event took place on Tuesday night, February 25th, 1992, at a Philadelphia sports bar that was part-owned by local baseball legend Mike Schmidt. Adhering to Gordon's tighter budget, the lineup for the card wasn't exactly impressive from a name standpoint, as the only performer with any renown was former WWF champion Ivan Koloff, now pushing 50 and years past his prime. The rest of the card was populated with guys that would have been underneath wrestlers at TWA events. Other than Koloff putting over Tony Stetson, a former WWF enhancement talent of the mid-80s, the only notable occurrence at ECW's inaugural event was a controversial ending. Larry Winters, who booked the card, teamed with Johnny Hotbody against JT Smith and DC Drake in the main event. In the post-match, Winters and Hotbody were supposed to paint Smith white and Drake black, the opposite of their actual flesh tones, but Winters somehow forgot the black paint, so only African-American Smith wound up getting painted. Horrified at how Winters carried out the angle, Gordon removed him as booker and took over those duties himself. Over time, the ECW roster did come to include some familiar veteran names, each meeting Gordon's strict requirements when it came to finance. Superfly Jimmy Snuka lived just over the bridge in New Jersey, so he made sense as he didn't require the purchase of plane tickets. Snuka's old 1980s rival Don Morocco did require air travel, but because Morocco's wife worked for an airline, he could get free flights into Philadelphia, so Gordon brought him in. Aging New Japan star Tatsumi Fujinami even made an appearance that spring as part of an angle that New Japan paid for. Otherwise, the undercard was an assortment of locals. As 1992 wore on, the Hot Bodies, Stetsons, and Smiths were supplemented with wrestlers like the snarling and brutal Pit Bulls Gary Wolfe and Anthony Durante, hard-hitting upstart Iron Man Tommy Cairo, and the even more blue-collar Sandman, who portrayed a good-natured surfer, thus making literal use of the word sand in his handle. ECW also struggled to find the perfect home venue, as after the sports bar closed that summer, they brought their shows to the Chestnut Cabaret, which initially required patrons to be 21 to enter. But while ECW continued to seek out a solid foundation, they got to work deciding their inaugural champions. Snuka was crowned the first ECW title holder on April 25th, 1992, after pinning fellow veteran Salvatore Bellomo. A day later, however, Snuka dropped the title to the much younger Hotbody. In all, Hotbody held the title for about 2.5 months before losing it back to Superfly in July. This enabled Snuka to renew hostilities with Morocco in late September, dropping the belt to the Magnificent One. And 7 weeks later, Morocco lost the ECW title to the Sandman. Supplementing the top belt was the television title, which Hotbody became the first holder of that August. This was in spite of the fact that ECW didn't have any televised presence yet, and wouldn't film its first pilot until that November. Nonetheless, Hotbody goes down in history as the first ever ECW television champion, and in fact, in the spring of 1993, he became the first ever Triple Crown winner after co-capturing the tag team belts that were minted the prior June. Until then, the first ECW tag team champions were the Super Destroyers, played by heavyweight brutes AJ Petrucci and Doug Stahl. All 3 titles were defended on the aforementioned TV pilot, a 4-match broadcast from the Kensington Sports Arena, hosted by announcers Jay Sully and Stevie Wonderful, who worked in ECW's production department. department. On the card, Cairo defeated King Kalua in the opener, tag champs The Destroyers went to a draw with Winters and Jimmy Jannetty, television champion Glenn Osborne went to a screwy finish with Snooker, and new ECW champion Sandman defeated a fellow called the Kodiak Bear. Certainly, it didn't resemble the ECW that most fans would come to know, and looked more like a typical nondescript indie of the day. As 1992 drew to a close, ECW made a few more strides toward a big-time feeling, co-promoting with New Jersey-based booker Dennis Coralluzzo. This allowed ECW to gain the one-time use of industrial stars like Davey Boy Smith and Kerry Von Erich in one of his final matches before his February 1993 death. That Von Erich match took place at a Gordon-Coralluzzo joint venture entitled Battle of the Belts, in which ECW champ Sandman faced Coralluzzo's title holder The Spider, the future headbanger Thrasher. Battle of the Belts also hosted a Texas death match between the legendary Terry Funk and his latest rival, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. Both were on hand as part of Coralluzzo's contingent, but each switched over to ECW shortly afterward, bringing their feud, which spanned several different indie groups, along with them. And the timing was perfect, as ECW was going to premiere on cable network Sports Channel Philadelphia the first week of April 1993. Not only did this give ECW two valuable names at the cusp of their TV phase, but it also gave them a new booker in Gilbert, who was an experienced producer in prior territories. This eased the workload of Gordon, who couldn't produce weekly TV in addition to running his outside business. The first official TV taping took place on March 12, 1993 at Cabrini College in Radnor, Pennsylvania, the same weekend that a freak winter storm blanketed most of the US East Coast. The torrential weather cancelled the second day's tapings, but allowed for Gilbert, with the aid of Funk, to sketch out future booking plans while holed up in a hotel room. After a successful first taping in front of a mere 250 fans due to the storms, Gilbert's future running ECW appeared to be bright. Ironically, Gilbert hired his would-be successor. Paul Heyman was coming off a tumultuous exit from WCW after falling out with showrunner Bill Watts. Still 27, Heyman had a wealth of experience in the wrestling business, much of which came as a manager under the name Paulie Dangerously, and could serve as an asset in a number of ways. Gilbert brought Heyman on board that spring to serve as both an on-screen personality and to assist in matters away from the ring. In fact, Heyman quickly became an ECW announcer, though the manner in which he obtained the headset was quite unusual. In the weeks after ECW premiered on local cable, Gilbert had come to dislike the broadcast style of Stevie Wonderful, who was initially hired by Gordon to assist on the production side, and Heyman absolutely did replace Wonderful, but he did so during a taping with the cameras running, after walking on screen and telling Wonderful he was needed backstage, and then promptly taking over his chair. This was, for all intents and purposes, the end of Stevie Wonderful in ECW, as he lost his job and was replaced on air in one fell swoop. Around the same time, Gordon still sought a reliable venue, and through Hotbody was put in touch with a Philadelphia native named Carmen Butch D'Amato. Through D'Amato's leadership of a performing club called the South Philadelphia Vikings, he had a facility on the corner of Swanson and Rittner Streets where his Vikings stored their floats and props, and where they could rehearse their routines. Known as Viking Hall at the time, Gordon was offered use of the building for his now monthly events, and henceforth in wrestling canon, Viking Hall became the ECW Arena. May 14th, 1993 was the date of the first ever ECW Arena card, a 12-match TV taping that kicked off with a sizable acquisition in the form of Road Warrior Hawk. The recognizable heavyweight bowled over local wrestlers the Samoan Warrior and Don E. Allen in a handicap match in what goes down in history as the first ever match at the ECW Arena. The first extreme moment at the arena came when the Dark Patriot, Eddie Gilbert's brother Doug, threw JT Smith out of the balcony and then proceeded to dive on top of him. After that sort of extreme christening, the time had arrived for the ECW Arena to host its first supercard card. The extremely wordy Super Summer Sizzler Spectacular drew 650 fans to the arena on Saturday night, June 19th for a 9-match card that would comprise ECW's first ever home video release. The Spectacular included a host of well-known faces like Snooker, who defended the television title twice, and veteran brawler Dick Murdoch. For the finale, Gilbert one-upped rival Funk by defeating him in a chain match, giving him the unofficial title of King of Philadelphia. Heavily influenced by Jerry the King Lawler, who was his professional idol, Gilbert seemed keen to book himself as the Lawler of this territory, and the regal splendor only made the parallel feel more on the nose. And just as Lawler fostered promising talents in Memphis through the years, Gilbert was eager to champion an old friend in Shane Douglas, fresh off a disillusioning run in WCW. Generally a white meat babyface during his career, Douglas entered ECW as a heel, with Gilbert giving him the nickname Fabulous as a nod to another Memphis-centric act, the Fabulous Ones. Whatever the name, it didn't take long for Douglas to become ECW's top champion. Back in April 1993, the ECW title passed from Sandman back to Morocco. The second reign of Morocco lasted a shade over 4 months before he dropped it on August 8th to an old WWF foe in Tito Santana. Santana actually finished up with the Federation later that week, meaning the reigning ECW champion actually worked a couple of WWF house shows back in 1993. But Santana's ECW run wasn't going to last all that long. Per the accepted canon, Santana lost the title to Douglas on September 9th in Roanoke, Virginia. However, even the deepest dive of pro wrestling results won't unearth the card that the title change took place on. That's because there was no card. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, ECW opted to run a phantom title change, switching the belt to Douglas. Santana remains just as mystified as to why he wasn't simply asked to lay down for Douglas as he would have done it. Instead, ECW just cut out the middleman and announced that Douglas won the belt in a fictitious match. Almost coinciding with the title change was a change in company branding. Earlier that September, ECW became a member of the struggling National Wrestling Alliance. At the time, the NWA was a barely functioning shell of its former glory, having recently parted ways with World Championship Wrestling. When ECW was admitted, the other promoters included Dennis Coraluzzo from New Jersey, Howard Brody from Florida, Steve Rickard in New Zealand, and the recently joined Smoky Mountain owner Jim Cornette. With ECW joining the alliance, their formal name became NWA Eastern Championship Wrestling. Other than that arrangement, plus a purported $500 membership fee, ECW's business was set to continue on as Gordon and company saw fit. The next order of business was ECW's second major event, Ultra Clash, on September 18th. New champion Douglas would defend his belt against the Sandman, while Stan Hansen and Abdullah the Butcher were set to partner with Funk and Gilbert respectively in a tag team dream match. However, Gilbert wasn't going to participate in that contest. Gilbert and Gordon started to experience problems that summer, allegedly stemming from personal issues on the part of Hot Stuff, as well as increased paranoia. Gilbert began missing sessions at ECW's TV studio and had reportedly grown wary of both Heyman and the company's connection with fellow promoter Jim Crockett Jr., who had recently returned to the wrestling business with a new startup. Gilbert had hard feelings toward Crockett for how he was booked in JCP in the late 80s, and now apparently felt his position in ECW was going to be undermined. Less than 2 weeks before Ultra Clash, Gilbert suddenly resigned from ECW. A fed-up Gordon immediately booked Kevin Sullivan, another individual Gilbert reportedly detested, as his replacement in the tag team match, knowing it would stick in Gilbert's craw. However, per Gilbert's request, Gordon did allow him to cut a farewell promo at Ultra Clash as a way to save face on his own terms. And Gilbert, for his part, did encourage fans to continue supporting ECW after his departure. With Gilbert gone, Heyman officially took control of the book, upon which the company began its metamorphosis into the ECW everyone would come to know. 2 weeks after Ultra Clash, ECW held a two-part show at the arena called Bloodfest. And it was here that the new wave made its way ashore. On the first night of the twin bill, two debuting wrestlers would face off. One was northeastern indie standout the Tasmaniac, a primitive beast that mixed stereotypical brawn with an evolutionary array of suplexes. Though perhaps short by mainstream wrestling standards, the Tasmaniac was the sort of alternative fringe that would become the ECW norm under Heyman's stewardship, muting any blemishes by emphasizing staggering or unique positives. Across the ring from the Tasmaniac stood the frenetic madman known as Sabu. The nephew of Ed the Sheik Farhat, Sabu had cultivated an international following for his uncontrollable wrestling style and his seeming lack of regard for human life. Though the first Sabu vs. Tasmaniac outing was relatively short, it was nonetheless a colorful primer into just how different pro wrestling's new alternative intended to be. Sabu won the encounter and then was quickly put over by Douglas the following night for the ECW title. As for Tasmaniac, he picked up his first ECW victory the following night over another debuting wrestler. 22-year-old Tommy Dreamer looked like the quintessential white meat babyface with an unassuming gaze and neatly coiffed jersey pompadour. And fans treated him as just that sort of vanilla good guy, reacting coolly to him during his early ECW run. Heels that Dreamer matched up with generally earned the more favorable response, but in time, Dreamer would win that part of the crowd over. Two heels that were hard to boo were the Public Enemy, Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge. The longtime indie rivals were put together by Heyman as a pair of street toughs that could deftly alternate between menacing and humorous, bringing a welcome undercurrent of levity to ECW's regular barbarism. Said barbarism could be provided by the Bad Breed, kayfabe brothers Axel and Ian Rotten, who swung barbed wire weapons as often as they did basic maneuvers. Calling this uptick in mayhem was a new hire in college-aged Joey Styles, whose dry and sober narration would be punctured with shrieks of "Oh my God" for the remainder of the promotion's lifetime. Each of these names was on hand for the latest major event, this one bearing a name with lasting power. The first ever November to Remember occurred on November 13th, 1993, for which nearly 1,500 fans packed the ECW arena, a new company attendance record. For the first November to Remember, ECW brought in a host of familiars like Hawk, Jim Neidhart, and King Kong Bundy, while advertised performer Medusa backed out of a match with Sensational Sherry after signing with WWF. On the night, Sabu became a double champion, pinning television titleist Funk in a tag team main event. Elsewhere on the card, Dreamer and Johnny Gunn, aka future WWF mid-carder Salvatore Sincere, both lost singles encounters on the same night that they upset tag champs Johnny Hotbody and Tony Stetson in 9 seconds to win the belts. Booking like that demonstrated how Heyman's ECW was willing to subvert expectations for the sake of creating a memorable moment. ECW closed out a whirlwind 1993 the day after Christmas with Holiday Hell, where one of the advertised attractions was a body count match between Rocco Rock and Pat Tanaka of Bad Company, in which the losing wrestler's partner would be blown up in a shark cage. Rock lost, but through a swerve, it was Tanaka's partner Paul Diamond that endured a shabby immolation with poor special effects, leaving irritated fans groaning and jeering. The embarrassing footage has never surfaced. More beneficial to ECW's future was a significant title change, as Funk defeated double champ Sabu to win the ECW title. At 49 years of age, Funk made for an ideal grizzled vet, a resolute gunslinger that retained all the necessary tools to credibly carry a rising promotion as its champion. On February 5th, 1994, 1,000 fans flooded the ECW arena for an event that would become known as the Night the Line Was Crossed, a seminal card that many believe is the moment ECW came of age. In the main event, Funk defended his championship against both Douglas and Sabu, one of the earliest three-way matches of any renown. Just as was the case with Funk versus Douglas a month earlier, the match went to a draw, this time a full hour. Fans at the arena gave all three men a standing ovation afterwards. Post-bout interviews only further enhanced the match's legend. An irate Heyman, Sabu's manager, grumbled that Funk and Douglas colluded to make sure that Sabu did not regain the belt. Douglas left the fabulous handle in the dust to become the franchise of ECW, and his obscenity-laden tirade let the world know that he was the true champion. Then, stoic, amused Funk calmly told Douglas off, leading to a massive pull-apart that assured the feud over ECW's richest prize was far from over. And indeed, Douglas regained the title in an 8-man Ultimate Jeopardy match in late March. The Night the Line Was Crossed was also host to another building block moment, though few fans realized it at the time. At the midway point of the show, floundering babyface Dreamer lost to heel Snooker, and as expected, it was Superfly that got the lion's share of cheers. Snooker did win, but only after Dreamer earned a curious concession. He got to kick out of the patented Superfly Splash, an unheard of development. Dreamer still lost, but that one little spot added a necessary stone to his foundation of grit. While fans were apt to treat Dreamer as a glorified loser, ECW produced a loser by design and dispatched him to the lower card. Mikey Whipwreck looked to be barely out of high school and wrestling in attire that probably doubled as pajamas. For months, Whipwreck never got in a single offensive move, as bloodthirsty heels demolished him like a mid-afternoon snack. This was in sharp contrast to Heyman's imposing bodyguard 911, who had one move, a chokeslam, and employed it to either win brief matches or silence any scripted nuisance that was pissing off the crowd. One regular babyface was given a rather ballsy heel makeover. The Sandman fell out with both his wife Lori, stage name Miss Peaches, and fellow good guy Tommy Cairo, and descended into a caricature of a chain-smoking, beer-guzzling abuser, a decidedly unfriendly character unlikely to elicit any sympathy from the crowd. For a time, Sandman's promos and matches were shown in black and white, an artistic choice that accented the plain horridness of his turn and his actions thereafter. He soon adopted Nancy Woman Sullivan as his new valet and added a signature weapon, a kendo stick redubbed a Singapore cane, playing off the recent news story of American teenager Michael Fay facing corporal punishment in Singapore for vandalism. Sandman feuded with Cairo and Lori by extension over the months ahead, and pivoted into a feud with Dreamer that would have far-reaching implications for the designated protagonist. But in the meantime, Sandman continued on his brutish path, eventually securing Metallica's Enter Sandman as his ever-appropriate theme song. While the audience watched Sandman's home life ostensibly fall apart, they were also witness to the makings of a very interesting co-op. With WCW contracted performer Kevin Sullivan acting as the go-between, ECW forged a working agreement with the Atlanta-based promotion, a deal that included a bit of light talent exchange. On May 14th, at an event titled When Worlds Collide, two former Heyman clients worked the main event, when Sabu teamed with beautiful Bobby Eaton to face Funk and Arn Anderson, who shortly after teamed in WCW in Colonel Parker's stud stable. A week after that interpromotional battle, Funk took part in WCW's Slamboree as part of a special Legends match against Anderson's longtime partner Tully Blanchard. Slamboree took place in Philadelphia, so when Funk made his entrance, knowing revelers like recognizable ECW arena goer John Hat Guy Bailey, ever familiar in his straw hats and Hawaiian shirts, serenaded him with chants of ECW. And it was at that slamboree that a certain wrestler teamed with Sullivan to win the tag team titles, and one of those belts was about to become part of ECW lore. Cactus Jack had been part of WCW for much of the early 90s, and carved out a sizable fan following for his manic promos and high-risk performing style. In just the previous 8 months, Cactus main evented Halloween Havoc with Vader, lost part of his ear during a match in Germany, and warred with the Nasty Boys in a few cutting-edge hardcore matches. But Mick Foley believed that he'd hit a ceiling in WCW and wanted out. Tag belt or no tag belt. As part of the working agreement, Cactus came to ECW that June for a dream match with Sabu. After losing the expectedly brutal encounter with his table-smashing counterpart, Cactus cut a backstage promo where he spit on his WCW tag title, threw it to the floor, and decried the fact that he got out-hardcored by his opponent. While Cactus's promo was more about his frustration at being outdone by another madman, the suits in WCW, Booker, Ric Flair especially, took great exception to Jack's desecration of the belt. But Cactus cared little. He finished up with WCW that September and then made ECW his primary American home. In the midst of his leaving Atlanta, Cactus entered into a duo with fellow sadist Funk, though not by conventional means. The two were facing off in a singles encounter when the Public Enemy jumped both men. After Cactus and Funk got the advantage and left Rock and Grunge laying, the hardcore legend asked for a chair, to which arena goers, in a truly timeless visual, showered the ring with in excess of 100 folding chairs, burying the tag champs under seats, while Funk and Cactus did all they could to duck and cover. This was to set up a tag title match, which Funk ended up no-showing for disputed reasons. To salvage the bout, Cactus teamed with an extremely reluctant Whipwreck. To this point, Whipwreck not only started getting some offense in his matches, but he even accidentally won the television title from Pitbull Gary Wolf. He then went on to accidentally retain the belt several times before his luck ran out in August. However, Mikey's luck was renewed on August 27th, when he scored the fluke pin on Rock to net he and unlikely partner Cactus the tag titles. That feel-good win for Cactus and Whipwreck was overshadowed by a much more serious championship situation, one that began brewing months earlier. As an NWA member promotion, ECW was selected to host the tournament to crown the new holder of the 10 pounds of gold. Heyman and Gordon, however, had already had their fill of the NWA. In particular, Jersey promoter Dennis Coraluzzo. Reportedly, Coraluzzo attempted to sabotage ECW events on several occasions, either by calling the Philadelphia Fire Department to bogusly report fire code violations, or by going into the arena parking lots and trying to take the air out of fans' tires. When ECW was awarded the NWA title tournament, Coraluzzo meddled to the degree that he vowed to oversee the tournament personally, even though it wasn't his jurisdiction. Tired of Coraluzzo and feeling that they were gaining nothing from their NWA affiliation, Heyman and Gordon quietly vowed to secede from the alliance. After it was agreed to have ECW champ Douglas win the NWA title tournament, they covertly conspired with the franchise to give the NWA the ultimate kiss-off, throwing down the belt during his planned victory speech. Though hesitant, Douglas quickly came to resent Coraluzzo as much as his bosses did, and got on board with the plan. The 8-man tournament was held on August 27th, and as ordained, Douglas went through Tasmaniac, Dean Malenko, and then 2 Cold Scorpio to win the NWA belt. With Gordon and an unsuspecting Coraluzzo standing ringside, Douglas went into a heartfelt speech, listing off many of the belt's former champions before defiantly shouting, "And they can all kiss my ass," before throwing the title to the mat. Douglas then disavowed the NWA as a whole before declaring the ECW belt to be a world championship and proclaiming that he was there to ignite the new flame of the sport of professional wrestling. Coraluzzo was livid and vowed to block any of these maneuvers on ECW's part. Gordon's response was to appear on ECW television days later, where he formally announced that Eastern Championship Wrestling had officially folded and was reincarnated as Extreme Championship Wrestling, with Douglas recognized as the first world champion. In a symbolic gesture after Gordon's announcement, the Public Enemy made the appropriate edits to ECW's television banner with the aid of spray paint. This new ECW was apt to live up to the Extreme name, much to Dreamer's physical detriment. After losing to the Sandman in a match where the loser received 10 lashes with the Singapore cane, pristine pretty boy Dreamer took all 10 strikes, despite the searing and unbearable pain that each caused, and despite a devilish woman allowing him the chance to quit like a coward. In the end, Sandman was just as slack-jawed as the Philly crowd when a blood-soaked Dreamer defiantly stood up after the last lash and asked Sandman through gritted teeth, "Is that all you got?" The next twist in this blood feud occurred when Dreamer blinded Sandman during an ensuing I Quit match, knocking Sandman's lit cigarette into one eye, then caning the other. With Sandman hurt, everybody, including Dreamer, broke character, leading fans to believe that Sandman was legitimately injured. In fact, to sell the damage, Sandman didn't leave his house for a month. When he turned back up, it was with protective eyewear for what was supposed to be his retirement speech. Instead, it was a trap to lure a remorseful Dreamer in so that Sandman, 20/20 vision and all, could cane him into oblivion. That masterful worked shoot angle culminated at the second annual November to Remember, which was quickly cementing itself as ECW's signature event. The use of Guns N' Roses' November Rain as show theme was a vital touch as well. At the time Sandman was breaking his Singapore cane over Dreamer's skull, ECW's roster continued its evolution, as Heyman desired to showcase the finest in-ring wrestlers on the planet, particularly those considered too small to make a dent in the supposed big time. The night before the November to Remember, two of those wrestlers struck gold. Going into November 4th, the television title was held by journeyman wrestler Jason Knight, who dethroned Whipwreck in August. At the November 4th tapings in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, Jason lost the title to Scorpio, another ex-AD from a rapidly changing WCW. At the same tapings, Scorpio dropped the belt to Jason's newest client in Malenko, the cold and calculating technician that purportedly knew more than 1,000 holds. Both were on hand at November to Remember, helping flesh out ECW's deepest roster to date. Joining them was Chris Benoit, whom many considered to be one of the finest technical wrestlers on the planet. Knowing Benoit's value as a performer, Heyman booked the Canadian star in a dream match of sorts against Sabu. Unfortunately, the dream quickly became a nightmare when Sabu, as a result of an unconventional throw from Benoit, landed squarely on his head and broke his neck just 2 minutes into the match. Somehow, Sabu had enough physical faculties to try and continue on, before manager Heyman and kayfabe handler 911 put a stop to it. Sabu never blamed Benoit for the accident and chalked it up to an unfortunate mishap. Though Benoit was deeply regretful for causing the injury, ECW capitalized on the moment by nicknaming him the Crippler, which would be his handle for much of the remainder of his career. Forthcoming Benoit matches were less technical exhibitions and more about his ruthless destruction of opponents. As for Sabu, true to his character, the Daredevil was back in the ring just 13 nights after breaking his neck, pushing through the pain. For Benoit, his newfound notoriety landed him in a promising stable. Come early 1995, World Champion Douglas formed the Triple Threat, consisting of he, television champion Malenko, and Benoit. Both singles titles were in the Triple Threat camp, and it didn't take long for the tag titles to wind up there as well. 3 weeks after dismantling indie standout Al Snow in a prolonged one-sided beating, Benoit teamed with Malenko to win ECW's tag team titles, defeating Sabu and Taz, who themselves won the titles from the Public Enemy weeks earlier, in the first ever table match. Douglas, meanwhile, was defending the world title against visiting talents in order to raise its prestige. Former WCW champion Ron Simmons fell to the franchise, as did former Horseman Tully Blanchard, who initially drew Douglas into a rest hold-laden 43-minute marathon that greatly bored the crowd. Hector Guerrero and Marty Jannetty were also victims of Douglas's reign, which was approaching 1 year in length, having kicked off months before the switchover from Eastern to Extreme. As Douglas lorded over ECW at the dawn of 1995, a new potential top heel entered the fray. After weeks of promises and hype from deluded mid-carder Stevie Richards, the man formerly known as Scotty Flamingo and Johnny Polo debuted in ECW, but not in either guise. The real-life Scott Levy manufactured a sullen, brooding Gen X character called Raven, and he quickly made it clear that he was hell-bent on inflicting torment upon Dreamer, who was apparently a rival of his during their teenage years. Raven amassed an army in his war on the increasingly well-regarded Dreamer, including a one-time admirer of Dreamer's named Beulah McGillicuddy, whom Dreamer spurned, as the story went, on account of her being homelier in her adolescence. Flanked by various mercenaries at various times, Raven stood in opposition of Dreamer, who was magically unable to gain a victory on his cold-blooded rival. The crux of their long-lasting feud to come would be the fact that Raven, by hook or crook, would somehow remain undefeated against the innovator of violence, as it was often well-timed screwiness that prevented Dreamer from scoring that elusive victory. The same night that Raven made his ECW debut, Bad Breed brethren Axel and Ian Rotten were forced to split up after losing a tag team outing against the Pitbulls. But instead of each pursuing separate goals, the Rottens spent the ensuing 6 months feuding with each other, taking part in some of the most brutal matches ECW has ever seen. Most of the matches included the use of barbed wire in some form, while taped fist and strap matches were also part of their parade of melees. The long feud finally came to a head in the early summer when Axel and Ian faced off in a Taipei death match, in which both participants dipped their hands into glue and then covered the wet glue with shards of broken glass. The barbaric spectacle lasted only 7 minutes, with Axel prevailing to win the blood feud. In another sense, both Rottens were winners. Despite ECW being an admittedly distant third on the American promotional depth chart, readers of Pro Wrestling Illustrated voted Axel vs. Ian the feud of the year for all of 1995. On the subject of hardcore wrestling, noted tough guys Sandman and Cactus Jack found themselves in their own rivalry in the early months of 95. This included battling in a Texas death match that could have been considered a comedic farce if not for the more serious implications. During the course of the fight, Sandman was badly concussed, to the point where he kept forgetting to stay down for the 10 count. The match dragged on until mercifully a cloudy Sandman remembered to keep counting the lights. Weeks later, after Cactus dispatched of true ECW original DC Drake, Sandman had a clever surprise waiting for his nemesis. Through the use of a large sheet-adorned gift box, Sandman orchestrated a ruse that led to the reveal of a returning Terry Funk, now at odds with Cactus after last being seen as his partner more than 6 months earlier. While Sandman pursued Shane Douglas's world title, Cactus took the detour with Funk, ultimately defeating his pernicious mentor in a hard-hitting clash that April. On the same night that Cactus vanquished one of his few true peers in hardcore wrestling, the Sandman regained a belt that he'd last held more than 2 years earlier. Douglas's year-plus reign as ECW World Champion came to an end when Sandman scored an unconventional pin out of Douglas's own application of a chicken wing. This led to Douglas crying foul over the late-match interference of Woman, who struck Douglas's legs with the Singapore cane while the chicken wing was cinched in, causing him to fall backward. In one of his first acts post-belt, Douglas took to wearing a Monday Night Raw t-shirt at an ECW event, loudly proclaiming that he was planning to leave the company. At the time, Douglas's rebellious act was considered to be just an angle, but eventually Douglas entered negotiations to jump to the WWF and agreed to what was considered a pretty promising offer. On his way to becoming snooty school teacher Dean Douglas in New York, the outgoing franchise was chokeslammed by 911, the signature "don't let the door hit you on the ass" farewell for certain outgoing wrestlers of the day. One wrestler didn't stick around for a farewell moment: Sabu. Scheduled to be part of a high-profile three-way tag match for the belts on April 8th, Sabu inadvertently double-booked himself, accepting a booking with New Japan for the same day. Heyman ended up firing Sabu for what he felt was an unprofessional decision, especially given how much hype had gone into the match pitting him and Taz against champions Benoit and Malenko and fellow challengers the Public Enemy. Heyman subbed Rick Steiner in as Taz's one-night partner, but that wasn't all he did. Early on the April 8th card, entitled Three-Way Dance, Heyman sermonized before the 1,100 fans in attendance, openly burying Sabu for picking New Japan over ECW, and making it clear to the crowd that what Sabu did was a slap in the face to all of them. In response to Heyman's rabble-rousing words, the Philly crowd chanted Sabu and continued to chant it during ensuing matches. The Public Enemy may have ended up winning the titles for a third time, but the bigger story was Sabu's exile. Clearly, ECW needed someone to restore order, and unfortunately, Douglas gave them one. In one of his final angles before jumping ship, Douglas introduced a new referee on behalf of the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission that would keep ECW's resident riffraff in line. Bill Alfonso was likely a familiar face to anyone that regularly watched wrestling in the preceding years, but scarcely did he steal the spotlight in his officiating capacity. In ECW, however, Fonzie was about to become the most hated man on Earth, simply by actually enforcing the rules. Alfonso first made his mark by disqualifying Dreamer in a tag team match for using a closed fist when striking Raven. Months later, Alfonso tried to halt the Bad Breed's Type A death match 90 seconds in, due to a solitary trickle of blood flowing from Ian Rotten's forehead. And when he wasn't being strict with the rules, Alfonso was outright showing heel bias, like when he reversed a decision in a barbed wire match that prevented Cactus from beating Sandman for the world title. While fans were unhappy with Alfonso's ridiculous meddling, they were more than satisfied by what was happening in the television title picture. Malenko dropped the belt to Scorpio in March, though Too Cold would only reign with the belt for 3 weeks. That's because at Three-Way Dance, Scorpio lost the title to another incoming Marvel in Eddie Guerrero. Guerrero had been part of the cutting-edge Rudos duo Los Gringos Locos with partner Art Barr in AAA, and they were intended to come to ECW together. However, Barr passed away in November at just 28 years of age. Adopting Barr's Frog Splash as his own finish in tribute, Guerrero took ECW by storm, first winning the belt from Scorpio, and then having multiple Match of the Year candidates with Malenko over the months ahead. Though spotlighting non-hardcore wrestling had been part of the Heyman playbook since taking over ECW, Guerrero vs. Malenko was utterly state-of-the-art, and fans applauded feverishly for all of their intricate sequences and deft counters. The two exchanged the television title during the summer months in what were almost always the best matches on a given ECW card. The tag team scene was less about technical proficiency, but that hardly mattered. Joining Public Enemy, the Pit Bulls, and Raven and Richards in a crowded scene were new duos like the Dudley Boys and the Eliminators. The former group, in their original form, consisted of bandier siblings Dudley Dudley and Snot Dudley, along with the unstable powerhouse Big Dick Dudley. Bubba Ray, Devon, and Spike would all come around over the ensuing year and a half. The Eliminators were Perry Saturn and John Cronus, heavyweight martial artists with deadly strikes and a deadlier finish called Total Elimination. Another inbound duo set their sights on Public Enemy, and their entry was a bit controversial. After raising hell in Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling, New Jack and Mustafa of the Gangsters barreled into ECW, bringing their unrestrained promos and wild street fighting style to their wars with rock and grunge. Where there was controversy was in how the Gangsters exited Smoky Mountain, due to them jumping ship before their agreed-upon exit date, with Heyman reportedly vowing to Cornette that he wouldn't use them until they'd honored their dates, but then doing so anyway. One of the early battles between the Public Enemy and the Gangsters was a weapons-filled cage match at the 1995 Heatwave, and concluded with a jaw-dropping visual. With New Jack laid across 2 stacked tables, Rock ascended the cage and then propelled off with a moonsault through New Jack and the double dose of lumber. ECW milked the moment on their weekly TV show, freeze-framing or cutting away before the moment of impact, in order to entice home viewers to purchase the VHS of the event. One moment ECW was happy to broadcast was the so-called chair shot heard round the world. In the ever-escalating war between Dreamer and Raven, the still winless innovator of violence got one over on his enemy by handcuffing him to that same steel cage, spreading his arms out in a crucifixion pose. Then, with chair in hand, Dreamer charged forth and dented the weapon on the crown of Raven's skull, punctuating his act by striking the same arms-out stance in front of his unconscious enemy. As things were heating up in ECW, life had changed behind the scenes. That spring, Gordon sold his interests in ECW to Heyman, after a period in which ECW failed to make a deal with investors and had a potential TV deal with HBO fall through. Gordon felt that irresponsibility on Heyman's part was leading ECW to ruin, and after their lifelines went unrealized, he sold off to Paul E. Gordon remained the on-air babyface commissioner of ECW while still helping out with certain business aspects, but otherwise it was now Heyman's company. While the bigger TV deal never materialized, ECW was forced to deal with a hiccup with one of its syndicates. Florida's Sunshine Network temporarily pulled ECW off the air later that summer, following a controversial angle in which Sandman beat Mikey Whipwreck senseless with his Singapore cane after a match. All the while, Woman feigned a specific type of pleasure over the microphone. The angle mimicked a scene from the 1994 film Natural Born Killers, but that was of no matter to the Sunshine Network, as ECW had to fight to get back on the air in one of their top non-Philly markets. Those Florida fans would miss the beginning of one of the most challenging heel turns to date. Beloved Cactus Jack going bad, in a company where his style and sacrifices were greatly appreciated. Cactus double-crossed Dreamer at the end of an 8-man tag, just as, of course, Dreamer was about to pin Raven. Suddenly, Cactus became a staunch critic of the hardcore wrestling he'd made his name on, and tried to prevent Dreamer from walking the same regrettable path he'd sauntered down. Mick Foley made the turn memorable by delivering some of the absolute greatest promos of his career. The one most oft-cited was his Kane Dewey speech, in which a disgusted Foley recalled the night months earlier when he saw a fan hold up a sign jokingly advocating that Sandman beat Foley's toddler-aged son. While the sign was meant in grim humor, Foley wasn't laughing, and he made his revulsion clear. Through near-weekly promos, Cactus Jack veered between deathly serious and dementedly funny in a way that few performers could capably equal. His anti-hardcore crusade continued through the autumn months and is arguably one of Foley's strongest runs as a performer. It was during that run that Foley began considering a move to the WWF. Meanwhile, 3 of its internationally renowned peers already made their own move. In August, WCW signed away Benoit, Malenko, and Guerrero to comprise the foundation of a still-to-come cruiserweight division. Malenko and Guerrero finished up their ECW run on August 26th with a 2-out-of-3 falls match, where the final fall ended in a double pin. Afterward, both men were given a warm send-off by fans and wrestlers alike, appreciation for the stellar performances ECW was fortunate to host. While Heyman appeared placid during the farewell segment at the ECW arena, he was far less serene after the ring was cleared. With the stage to himself, Heyman delivered an in-show tirade in excess of a half hour, railing against WCW and claiming that WCW used their political connections with New Japan, with whom Malenko, Guerrero, and Benoit all wrestled, to muscle them into jumping, when in actuality, the three just wanted to make more money. Heyman ranted about the evils of WCW and Eric Bischoff, while the fervor of the crowd resembled a raucous political rally. In the short term, Heyman found two dynamic replacements for the outgoing technicians. From Mexico's AAA came Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis, two men that had wrestled each other countless times throughout the 90s to this point. Their usual dance of death took on a more extreme flavor as they dazzled the arena faithful with crisp aerial maneuvers and gravity-defying takedowns on September 16th. Mysterio may have been barely taller than the top rope, but that hardly mattered to his new audience, as he looked like an absolute star en route to victory. Over the months ahead, the ascendant battles continued, with Psychosis winning a 2-out-of-3 falls match at the next arena card. 3 weeks later, Mysterio teamed with Conan to defeat Psychosis and La Parka in tag team action. The feud was blown off at the 1995 November to Remember, where Mysterio defeated Psychosis in an arena-spanning Mexican death match. After dispatching his horned rival, Mysterio took on other challengers, including the equally aerodynamic Juventud Guerrera in early 1996. Their match spilled into the frigid parking lot, where Mysterio executed a Hurricane Rana by jumping off some fan's car. On the night that Mysterio and Psychosis first took to an ECW ring, several storylines converged in one of the most celebrated matches the company ever produced. Raven and Richards defended their tag team titles in a 2-out-of-3 falls double dog collar match against former Raven lackeys the Pitbulls. The first two falls ended quickly enough, setting the stage for absolute chaos to reign during the finale, in the form of a million run-ins. There was the ongoing catfight wars between Raven valet Bueller and fan-turned-valet Francine. Then there was Dreamer interjecting himself after Pitbull Anthony Durante was injured. He chained himself to Raven and scored an apparent pinfall on his tormentor to apparently switch the belts. Then Bill Alfonso hit the ring to nullify the decision, thus once more depriving Dreamer of his coveted score. When Big Dick Dudley chokeslammed an irate Dreamer, Alfonso, who had previously banned the chokeslam so as not to incur 911's wrath, hastily unbanned the move for a night. Then 911 quickly stormed the ring and delivered that cathartic, long overdue chokeslam on the crooked ref to an insane pop. Oh, and a suddenly healthy Durante turned up so that he and Gary Wolf could finish Raven and Richards off to win the belts. It was a 5-star epic on detail alone. In the world title picture, the biggest underdog wound up persevering. After months of chasing the Sandman as his most unlikely challenger, Mikey Whipwreck ended Sandman's 6-month-plus reign on October 28th, splashing him beneath a ladder to win the title, completing his own Triple Crown. Though the culmination of a feel-good saga, Whipwreck's time at the top lasted only 6 weeks, as Sandman regained the title on December 9th in a 3-way match. More on that third participant in a bit. Sandman's latest reign wouldn't last 6 months. In fact, it only lasted 7 weeks. On January 27th, 1996, Sandman dropped the title to a fellow heel in Raven, succumbing to the even flow DDT. But the belt wasn't all that Sandman lost. Post-match, Valet Woman left him to formally rejoin then-husband Kevin Sullivan in WCW. In her parting angle, Woman asked Sandman to come with her to the greener pastures of Atlanta. but Sandman happily spurned the offer to remain in ECW's blue-collar environs. Another example of ECW using somebody's exit to galvanize their own company. Months before Nancy Sullivan fled for Atlanta, a somewhat surprising cast-off went from Atlanta to Philly. Fired from WCW under contentious circumstances in mid-September, Steve Austin brought a lot of rattlesnake venom with him to ECW shortly thereafter, burying Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff in biting parody sketches. Once one of the fastest rising stars in the Big Two, injuries and politics put a rigid ceiling over Austin's head in WCW, and a rough 1995 saw Austin get shown the door by Bischoff. Over the phone, no less. Austin ended up wrestling twice for the Philadelphia outfit, both times for the world title. The first was a loss to Whipwreck at the 1995 November to Remember, and the second was in the aforementioned three-way bout that Sandman reclaimed the gold. For that match, Austin chopped off his receding blonde hair, appearing for the first time with a rugged crew cut. And that's how Austin looked when he debuted for the WWF 9 days later as the Ringmaster. A terrible gimmick that fortunately sat one role away from the character that Austin was born to play. Before Foley joined Austin up north, he took part in one of the more regrettable moments in ECW history. One that very well could have resulted in a major catastrophe. At the October 28th ECW Arena card, anti-hardcore Cactus Jack lost to Dreamer in the main event, with Raven in his corner and a once more returning Funk in Dreamer's. Post-match, a chair wrapped in a kerosene-soaked towel that had been set on fire came into use. Cactus went to feign a swing at Funk, but the fiery towel came apart, and as a result, a flaming chunk landed on Funk's back. Chaos ensued from there, as flame-riddled Funk dashed in pain around ringside, while one fan was reportedly burned as well. As staffers arrived with fire extinguishers, the lights in the arena suddenly went out, as had been planned for the next step of the angle. Fleeing fans now had to escape the ECW arena in total darkness, and thankfully avoided a stampede situation. Funk suffered second-degree burns, but ECW dodged a major bullet otherwise. The company even made it out of a subsequent regulatory hearing with little more than a fine for not having a doctor on site. Heyman knew he had to make it up to the fans who were traumatized by the angle gone wrong. So to kick off the 1995 November to Remember, he presided over the reveal of a returning star, Sabu. Heyman's bitter speech from April and the fans' equally sour chants that followed were all wiped away as Sabu pointed to the ceiling amid wild cheers and embraced Heyman in the middle of the ring. In his return bout, Sabu defeated mid-card brawler Hack Myers. One wrestler wasn't so sugary about Sabu being back. Largely inactive since breaking his neck in July, Taz, having long since shed the wild man persona, turned heel at the November card, slugging Tod Gordon during the Commissioner's match with Nemesis Alfonso. The once understated Taz then went on a harsh tirade about his prodigal former tag team partner getting the red carpet treatment for his return, when Taz hadn't gotten the same sort of love when he valiantly fought back from a catastrophic injury. Sabu and Taz, two of Heyman's first official acquisitions for ECW, were set on a collision course. But it would be a long time before those vessels got within striking distance of each other. Following Sabu's comeback, ECW continued fortifying its roster with talents that had considerable upside. Returning to the fold was Douglas, a mere 6 months after he'd went off to start a new life in New York. One fresh pickup was Sabu's longtime associate Rob Van Dam, the springboarding, high-timing martial artist that could back up his many boasts. With equal global seasoning was Lionheart Chris Jericho, fresh from a stirring Super J-Cup battle against fellow dungeon grad Chris Benoit. And for the comedic side of the roster, the Blue Meanie and Supernova both debuted as Raven flunkies alongside fellow goofball Richards. Then there were the exits. Early mainstays, the Public Enemy agreed to jump to WCW, leaving after one last tussle with the Gangsters. The monstrous 911 was also out, leaving for disputed reasons. But the biggest name to leave in this period was Cactus Jack, who agreed to terms with WWF in late '95 and finished up with ECW in March. After defeating Whipwreck in his farewell, Foley strutted out of the arena alongside Richards and Meanie, following an appropriately corny dance routine. Far less quaint was the arrival of Brian Pillman, recently seen playing an unabashed nutjob in The Four Horsemen. Truthfully, playing would have been subjective in the eyes of even his closest peers, many of whom came to the conclusion that Pillman had just generally lost his mind at some point. What actually happened was that Pillman, in an ambitious attempt to have all the major companies bid on him at once, embarked on a precarious, attention-grabbing worked shoot in which he gained a legitimate release from WCW after a bizarre on-camera incident with Kevin Sullivan, and then promptly went to ECW. Continuing his carefully meted-out madness in Philadelphia, Pillman hijacked the 1996 CyberSlam, horrified Joey Styles with his antics, threatened to urinate in the ring, and then stabbed a planted fan with a dinner fork. The whole thing was presented as a work that had gone too far, just as Pillman wanted it. In the midst of further ECW appearances, the loose cannon was unfortunately involved in a serious vehicular accident that badly destroyed one of his ankles. The accident took away his agility, but Pillman did manage to secure a contract with the WWF on the merit of his newfound notoriety. Notoriety wasn't always a good thing for ECW, especially in the eyes of their TV partners. At the onset of 1996, Dreamer had managed to one-up Raven in a rather unexpected way. Beulah McGillicuddy revealed that she was pregnant and that Dreamer was the father. The innovator of violence then saved Beulah from the hands of an irate Raven before officially stealing away his hated enemy's girlfriend. That bit of melodrama was followed up in the spring months by an even more stupefying reveal. The audience learned that Beulah wasn't actually pregnant and had been cheating on Dreamer. Tommy demanded to know who the guy was, to which Beulah revealed that it was a she. The girl was Raven's replacement valet, Kimona Wanalea, with whom she shared a passionate kiss. Then Dreamer, ever the sportsman, revealed that he would take them both because he's hardcore. The crowd then roared at the pseudo-threesome that followed, though TV outlets were appalled. That verboten kiss got ECW's syndicated program thrown off the air in some markets, like New York and Florida, and relegated to late-night time slots in others. Raven's replacement for Kimona went in a different direction and was employed in the name of psychological warfare. The Sandman persisted as Champion Raven's top challenger for most of 1996, and Raven had the perfect counter-resistance: Sandman's estranged wife Lori, and her and Sandman's 6-year-old son Tyler. Raven adopted the two as his own family, and they even dressed in similar tattered Gen X wear to their new breadwinner. Tyler even called his father a drunk and declared that he worshipped Raven now. Usually stoic in the face of adversity and danger, Sandman became inconsolable, heartbroken at his son turning his back on him. Coming mere months after the public affections of Beulah and Kimona, some TV outlets were hesitant toward this angle, feeling it was over the line to portray such a harsh fragmentation of family. Nonetheless, the angle continued, with young Tyler in particular earning positive notice for his fairly convincing performance as a brainwashed child. Among so many storyline controversies, what Sabu had to work with was much more agreeable and straightforward. It didn't take long for Van Dam to lock horns with his longtime peer inside the ECW ring, first taking on Sabu in the spring. On May 11th, Van Dam defeated Sabu in a respect match where the loser had to humbly profess respect for the victor. After Sabu did as the stipulation asked, Van Dam played the role of a sore winner, gleefully telling Sabu off as the cherry on top of his big achievement. The feud raged on into the summer, with Sabu scoring a victory at June's Hardcore Heaven, and then beating Van Dam once more in a grueling stretcher match in August. The matches led petulant Van Dam to do a soft babyface turn, as by September he was hand-selecting Sabu to be his partner against All Japan standouts Doug Furness and Dan Crawford. Going forward, Van Dam and Sabu were a regular team, a pair of contrasting personalities that shared a similar affinity for awe-inspiring risks. Meanwhile, the television title played the role of hot potato for several months on end. After Scorpio spent much of the early part of the year as champion, he dropped the belt to Douglas, who dropped it 3 weeks later to Pitbull Durante, who himself lost it 3 weeks later to Jericho, who lost it 3 weeks after that back to Douglas in a four-way match between the aforementioned quartet. It was in that match that Douglas legitimately broke the neck of an interfering Gary Wolfe off of a single-arm DDT onto the title belt. Now flanked by a heel-turned Francine, Douglas feuded with Durante, who was fighting for the belt and revenge for his partner. On October 5th, ECW ran one of the most daring angles in their company's history when Wolfe, who had been fitted with a surgically implanted halo, tried to intervene as Douglas worked over Durante's own injured neck. To the horror of the entire crowd, Douglas seized Wolfe by the halo supports, shook him, and threw him to the mat. Fans were outraged by the galling and cowardly nature of the attack, and security had to get Douglas and Francine out of the building as a riot nearly ensued. Another moment from that October was possibly even crazier. On the night of the Halo incident, Sandman regained the ECW title, pinning surrogate defender Richards in a tag team bout while Raven was said to be injured. In actuality, Scott Levy was temporarily in rehab. 3 weeks later, on a night where Dreamer knocked imposing heel primetime Brian Lee off a scaffold through stacks of tables, Raven gained a measure of revenge in one of the most polarizing ways imaginable. With the aid of his flunkies, Raven attacked Sandman and fastened the battered champion to a makeshift cross, before crowning him with a coil of barbed wire. Fans at the ECW arena had seen plenty of line-stepping mayhem over the years, but this was too blasphemous for even a few of them. Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle was a guest that night and took great offense, threatening legal action if he appeared on the same televised program as the mock crucifixion. Heyman instructed Raven to give an out-of-character apology to try and quell some of the shock, which the top heel did, bemused as he was to do so. Richards and Meanie helped carry out the crucifixion despite personal objections, but happier times were coming. Having spent most of 1996 parodying people like Goldust and the band Kiss, Richards and Meanie, along with Supernova and others, re-debuted as the Blue World Order at the 1996 November to Remember. With Richards as Big Stevie Cool, Meanie as Da Blue Guy, and Nova as Hollywood Nova, the trio lampooned WCW's t-shirt selling reprobates to the enjoyment of all. And in this period, Stevie was formally separated from Raven to begin his own serious singles push. On the same card, a historic stare-down took place. In the years since turning heel, Taz had demolished everyone in his so-termed Path of Rage, while calling out Sabu at every opportunity. When Taz attacked Heyman in the ring that night, the lights suddenly went out. When they relit, Sabu stood across from Taz, each man striking their signature pose. The fans roared with excitement as both men were occupying the same space for the first time in a year and a half. These two were bound to face off at ECW's rumored first pay-per-view whenever that would transpire. But only a week later, something happened that put the planned pay-per-view in doubt. The Gangsters had been tag team champions since August, having won them from fellow top team The Eliminators. At a house show in Revere, Massachusetts, New Jack and Mustafa were supposed to face heel duo Devon Dudley and Axel Rotten, but Axel missed the show due to transportation issues. At the last minute, Heyman subbed in a purportedly local indie wrestler named Eric Koulas. Koulas was a super heavyweight 17-year-old that lied about his age to get onto the ECW show and was about to regret that choice. After reportedly irritating his fellow wrestlers by speaking out of turn, the inexperienced Koulas, who called himself Mass Transit, portraying a disgruntled bus driver, apparently asked New Jack to blade him during the match. New Jack obliged during the disorganized brawl by cutting into Kulas's head with a surgical scalpel, severing an artery. The blood loss was quick and horrendous, and Kulas required immediate medical attention. When word and fan cam footage of the incident got out, ECW's first pay-per-view, Barely Legal, was pulled from the provider's schedules, though Heyman eventually managed to plead his way back into their good graces. At the time ECW was getting ready to make a pay-per-view run, they had a new working agreement with the WWF, who was by this time losing in the Monday Night Wars to WCW. ECW needed WWF's national reach to promote themselves, while the kid-friendly WWF needed to appeal to the older, hipper fan base that ECW enjoyed. The first sign of the co-op was a planned confrontation at the September 1996 Mind Games pay-per-view in Philadelphia, in which Heyman, Sandman, and Dreamer sat front row, and ended with Sandman spewing beer on Savio Vega during the opening match. Months later, ECW invaded a Monday Night Raw taping at New York's Manhattan Center, at the invitation of designated agitator Jerry Lawler. The unusual 2-hour broadcast featured lots of sniping between Heyman and the King at the commentary table, while ECW put on 3 exhibition bouts. During the course of the show, Heyman plugged the upcoming pay-per-view as much as he could, before he and Lawler had a staged pull-apart to bring an end to the evening's angle. On Sunday night, April 13th, 1997, inside a packed and well-lit ECW arena, Heyman and company produced Barely Legal, the first pay-per-view outing for the ambitious super indie. A shade over 100,000 households purchased the 7-match card, and by all accounts, ECW delivered a winning product. The Eliminators won the tag titles from a now united Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley in the opener, while Rob Van Dam, subbing in for an injured Chris Candido, won a slick exhibition over the gifted Lance Storm. Representatives of Michinoku Pro Wrestling enthralled in a fast-paced trios bout, with the standout being the Great Sasuke. Douglas retained his TV title over Durante, but was then humiliated by Rick Rude, who spent months tormenting Douglas from behind a mask. In the most anticipated showdown, Taz choked out Sabu before Sabu, Van Dam, and Turncoat Alfonso left Taz lying. And in a 2-match parlay, 52-year-old Funk defeated Sandman and Richards in a 3-way top contenders bout, then defeated Raven to win the world title in a short main event. The arena's power went out shortly after a Bloody Funk celebrated with Dreamer in the crowd, but ECW had hit the home run they were looking for. However, it wasn't all good vibes. ECW was about to lose Raven to WCW effective that summer, but while Raven coveted the big payday, Van Dam coveted respect. Initially left off of Barely Legal before Candido's injury opened a door, Van Dam felt overlooked and considered leaving. He even reached out to WCW to inquire about a jump, but Heyman was able to keep Van Dam on board with the promise of a juicy story arc. Present Van Dam as an ungrateful mercenary and use him to further an ongoing inter-promotional war. After RVD was ostensibly written out following the May 10th arena card, he showed up on Roy's War 2 days later in union with Lawler, who crowned that he got one over on ECW by signing away the only worthwhile wrestler they had. Van Dam then proceeded to tear apart teenage Jeff Hardy in a veritable squash, while ECW television portrayed Van Dam as a turncoat and a sellout. This seemed to indicate that Van Dam was going to turn back up in ECW to continue the angle, and he did, although he wasn't alone. On June 7th, Dreamer finally scored that long elusive pin on Raven, defeating him in a loser leaves match at WrestlePalooza. However, his moment of catharsis was cut short when he was attacked by a returning Van Dam via the old lights off, lights on reveal. When Dreamer began to overpower RVD, Sabu then appeared via the same sort of reveal. When Dreamer once more got the upper hand, the lights went off a third time. When they came back on, crown-wearing Lawler stood in the ring, mic in hand, as the crowd went ballistic. While the King directed traffic and made barbed remarks, Sabu and Van Dam withstood the blitz of the entire locker room, taking everybody out as they hit the ring 1 or 2 at a time. Lawler ran down ECW's ideals and pride before Taz finally cleaned house, sending all the heels packing with just his mere arrival. The WWF ECW war had crossed over into the extreme terrain, leaving many to wonder what the next phase of combat was going to bring. Taz's appearance doubled as his entrance for a scheduled rematch against Sabu, a return bout from Barely Legal. This time, it was risk-taking Sabu that got the win, scoring what was then a rare pinfall victory on the well-booked Taz. After the match, Taz expressed frustration at ceding the rematch to his nemesis, but there was no rubber match to come, at least for now. Both Taz and Sabu were going in different directions, and Taz's brand new direction kicked off just seconds later. Alone in the ring, Taz was immediately taunted by television champion Douglas, who was situated in a pseudo-luxury box area with several triple threat associates. Soon, a veritable pissing match commenced, in which Taz vowed he could choke Douglas out in under 5 minutes. The two continued to up the ante, with Douglas agreeing to put his belt on the line and Taz bargaining down to a 3-minute challenge, and the promise that he would leave for a finite period if he couldn't get the job done. Less than 3 minutes later, Douglas tapped to the Kata Hajime, dropping the belt to Taz after the unscheduled match. While Taz would take the television title in a new direction, Douglas was about to have bigger fish to fry. Funk's world title reign motored on into the summer, where old rivals Douglas and Sabu were waiting. The now 53-year-old hardcore legend had his reign ended by Sabu on August 9th, following a hellacious barbed wire match. At one juncture, Sabu shredded his arm on the unforgiving strands, necessitating mid-match care to close the wounds. By the end, he and Funk were hopelessly entangled in the wires, and Sabu pinned the champ somewhat anticlimactically. The two were in action again 8 nights later at ECW's second pay-per-view, Hardcore Heaven, in Fort Lauderdale. The dimly lit event didn't come off as well as Barely Legal had, and demonstrated some of the amateurishness of the ECW product. Nonetheless, the main event was a strong one, as Douglas became ECW champ once more, defeating Funk and Sabu in a rematch of their famed 1994 battle that helped put ECW on the map. For the final fall, Douglas pinned Funk after 5 belly-to-belly suplexes. Hardcore Heaven was also where the ECW vs WWF war nominally peaked, as Dreamer defeated Lawler in an overbooked singles encounter. WWF-centric names like Rude, Jake Roberts, and Sonny all ran interference months after Jim Cornette made a surprise appearance to attack Dreamer, but Dreamer overcame all of it to give his company the win. In reality, it's not clear whether or not the war was originally intended to end here. ECW representation on WWF television ceased in June, after Heyman, Van Dam, and Sabu balked at what they felt was non-beneficial booking. Even with Dreamer's victory, the war between ECW and the WWF continued on Heyman's turf, though in a much more homogenized form. Gone was Lawler, replaced by WWF undercarders and trainees like German bodybuilder Brackus and former NFL defender Darren Drozdov. Even the Pitbulls, after getting fired from ECW that summer, turned back up to represent the WWF. But it was all a hollow shell of a once scorching angle. Van Dam defeated Dreamer in a flag match that November to blow off a feud that had already lost all of its steam. On the front of war, there was a very real issue with trust in ECW, or so it seemed. By mid-September, Tod Gordon was gone from the company he'd founded, and it wasn't clear where the truth behind his exit lay. The front page, or Heyman's version, was that Gordon was acting as a mole for WCW, trying to help lure Sandman, Sabu, Alfonso, and perhaps others into jumping ship for another ECW invasion, with WCW official Terry Taylor as his contact. Gordon contends that he was reaching out on behalf of those wrestlers looking to leave ECW because they were fed up with Heyman's management and not getting paid. Gordon's love-hate relationship with Heyman had endured plenty of strife by the time he sold his ECW interests to Paulie, and by 1997 was ready to leave the company he started. As Gordon tells it, Heyman needed him to be the scapegoat on his way out, so that Paul could galvanize the wrestlers and win back their trust. After Raven, the only ECW talents to jump to WCW in this period were Richards, Saturn, and Louis Spicolli, who would pass away from drug-related causes the following February at the age of 27. After being accused of helping perpetuate the alleged moling, Alfonso ended up saving his ECW job by nearly bleeding to death in an astounding match with Bueller that September. Another unexpected shakeup occurred at the top of the card, when at a Thursday night TV taping that October in Queens, at an Elks Lodge redubbed the Madhouse of Extreme, Triple Threat member Bam Bam Bigelow made a surprise challenge of his boss, World Champion Douglas. The Beast from the East flattened the franchise in mere minutes to capture the championship, but if one were to glance at the ECW pay-per-view calendar, they'd have seen the perfect opportunity for Douglas to win it back. The 1997 November to Remember was the first in the event's chronology to take place outside of Philly. The 97 card was held in Monica, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh, Douglas's hometown. Earlier house shows in Monica did strong business through Douglas co-promotional efforts, so there was bound to be a rabid crowd on hand to see Douglas get the belt back. And indeed, Douglas slayed the Goliath Bigelow on November 30th to reclaim his lost championship, albeit in a pretty wonky match, though it was at least better than Sandman and Sabu's infamous table and ladder duel that had an untold number of botched spots. ECW desperately needed a fresh face with upside at the top of their cards, and they appeared to find one. WWF castoff Al Snow began an incredible reinvention by innocuously finding a prop mannequin head and cutting promos with it. Feigning mental illness, Snow treated the head, known as Head, as a contentious ally, having one-sided arguments with the object in his continued bitter dissent. Fans caught on to the silliness of Snow and Head and began participating in his entrances by shaking their own styrofoam heads in tune with Snow's Prodigy theme music. Snow wasn't the only underutilized WWF performer that ECW helped repackage. PJ Walker suffered through over 2 years of wearing a jockstrap mask as Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese man of war. Arriving in ECW around the time Snow did, Walker adopted a less tattered version of Raven's wardrobe and grew out a bad boy goatee to become Just Incredible, a self-indulgent punk. Though light on actual motives, Credible took to the heel role well enough, mocking Dreamer after his grandfather died and relentlessly working over the injured knee of the great Sasuke during a singles encounter. Despite the creation of 2 fresher characters, ECW felt like The Walking Dead headed into their 4th pay-per-view Living Dangerously in March 1998. On a night of objectively bad action, the lone highlight was Bigelow, aligned with Douglas once more, winning the television title after putting Taz through the ring canvas on a stunning Taz Mission reversal spot. Otherwise, Living Dangerously shone a spotlight on just how small-time ECW felt after so much roster turnover, and a failure to upgrade its production or quality of talent. WrestlePalooza on May 3rd was arguably even worse, capped off by a main event in which world champion Douglas barely held off the popular Snow in a lackluster encounter. The match was hampered by Douglas working through serious injuries that were bad enough to sideline him for most of the ensuing summer. Heyman apparently had plans for Douglas to lose the belt to Taz, and apparently wasn't willing to have the franchise drop or vacate the gold anytime before then. With Douglas out of action, the championship picture took on a new shape. On April 4th, Bigelow dropped the television title to Van Dam, giving RVD his first belt in the company. His hot and cold partnership with Sabu sometimes cast the two as championship rivals, but also allowed them to win the tag titles from the mismatched duo of Candido and Storm in June. As for the television title, Van Dam would go on to hold the championship into the year 2000, 23 months in all. And Taz? He created his own championship, illustrating his storyline belief that Douglas wasn't actually hurt, but was instead ducking his challengers. In May of that year, at a TV taping in Queens, Taz introduced the FTW Heavyweight Championship, a renegade belt that gave Taz, in his eyes, legitimate claim as ECW's actual world champion. In making defenses of the unofficial title, Taz was trying to goad the ailing Douglas back into the ring for the title shot that he desired most. While Taz issued challenges, the Dudley Boys issued insults. A contemptful heel act, Bubba Ray and Devon were flanked by bodyguard brother Big Dick Dudley, muted placard bearer Sign Guy Dudley, and lascivious wordsmith Joel Gertner as their official MC. The Dudleys' matches were usually preceded by Bubba jawing at the assembled patrons, dispensing over-the-line rhetoric toward the fans and daring them to do something about it. On the night Taz introduced the FTW belt, the Dudleys actually coaxed one excited fan into jumping out of the lodge's second-floor balcony to try and rush the ring. With fleshed-out characters hardly an issue, mid-1998 was about getting the in-ring product back to a respectable level. Credible pivoted off into a rivalry with underrated mat mechanic Jerry Lynn, producing a number of quality bouts. The dissolution of Candido and Storm's partnership from Hell led to the expected singles encounters between the two talented athletes. And imported from Japan were one-time ECW competitor Mike Awesome and his iron-willed nemesis, the seemingly invincible Masato Tanaka. Awesome and Tanaka's brutal table and chair clashes became a highlight of 1998 ECW, at a time when the between-the-ropes action really needed that boost. The improvements to the in-ring product were evident at what many consider to be ECW's greatest pay-per-view ever. While some diehards are understandably partial to Barely Legal for its standing as the company's first, the 1998 Heatwave is celebrated on the strength of its soaring quality. Over 4,000 fans filled Dayton, Ohio's Hara Arena for a 6-match event that was free of the shoddy doldrums of recent ECW supercards. The aforementioned credible Lynn and Candido Storm rivalries played out in the undercard, with their collective expert technique setting the stage for the heavier action. And heavy it was, as Tanaka and Awesome brutalized each other in one of their heftiest encounters to date, enrapturing the Dayton crowd. It made the tag title match, pitting Van Dam and Sabu against visiting stars Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki, pale in comparison, though that was partially undone by issues in the tag match's final stage. Taz got his win back over Bigelow in a wild FTW title street fight, while Dreamer, Sandman, and Spike Dudley beat the 3 evil Dudleys in another street fight, which felt like a fun house show finale at times. Unfortunately for ECW, Sandman was done having fun within their house of hardcore. The second week of September, the true ECW original signed a 3-year deal to jump to WCW. Not only had Sandman reportedly not given any notice to the company, but a somewhat embarrassing issue was that the cane-swinging Libertine was the sole individual on the album cover of ECW's first ever musical release, due to hit shelves the following month, though the album contained Motorhead's cover of Enter Sandman rather than the Metallica original. Sandman wasn't the first ECW star to make a promotional jump at or near the peak of their popularity, but it was an especially damaging blow for an ECW that was still trying to find its legs as a national entity. The Sandman was a walking embodiment of what ECW meant for many fans, and to watch him leave for Atlanta just didn't seem right. In his absence, Heyman and company attempted to launch a replacement star, as Credible co-opted the Singapore Cane for his own use, and bragged early and often about running the Extreme Icon out of Philly. With Sandman going south, other former world champions were about to head the same way. Bam Bam Bigelow was set to follow him into the Turnerverse that November, agreeing to a contract just days before the November to Remember. Bigelow's last match was the main event of what turned out to be an objectively rancid pay-per-view, a far cry from Heatwave's excellence. There, he teamed with triple threat allies Candido and a healed-up Douglas to lose to Taz, Sabu, and Van Dam in a disjointed, mistake-filled match that led to heated arguing behind the curtain afterward. From there, the exits only mounted. Whipwreck became the third former ECW champion to agree to a jump to WCW in this stretch, putting pen to paper that December. Valet Chastity, who had seconded both Raven and Credible over the previous year and a half, agreed to jump to WCW as well. The Blue Meanie exited after 3 years to join the WWF's Job Squad, and Candido and Tammy Sitch were also removed from bookings due to a number of issues, leaving a depleted ECW without another pair of familiar faces. As was often the case with a company whose roster was frequently in flux, Heyman got to work backfilling. He found a pair of gems in Yoshihiro Tajiri and Super Crazy, and came up with a great way to showcase the international high flyers, frequently put them against each other. While Tajiri and Crazy worked with others as well, chiefly technically skilled full-blooded Italians member Little Guido, the two were often each other's greatest foe, and quickly made their presence known at the Guilty as Charged pay-per-view that kicked off 1999. Also debuting that night in Kissimmee, Florida, was an individual few would have ever associated with ECW before: Sid. Neither Vicious nor Justice, the towering heavyweight turned up as the client of crooked ref-turned-manager Jeff Jones, and demolished outgoing former tag champ John Cronus in about 90 seconds. Whereas one might think that Sid was emblematic of the limited heavyweights coveted by the more superficial wrestling promotions, ECW fans ate Sid up with a spoon and wildly cheered his rudimentary beatings of whatever poor bastard stood in his way. Guilty as Charged was also the culmination of Taz's world title chase, as he choked out Douglas in the main event to end the 13-plus month title reign of the franchise. The well-protected human suplex machine was positioned as unquestioned face of the company, while Douglas's future with ECW appeared to be in doubt. Not only were the multitude of injuries an issue, but Douglas had reportedly quarreled with Heyman prior to the pay-per-view. The following month, Douglas turned babyface after feigning retirement. With Bigelow gone and Candido AWOL, he and Valet Francine formed a pseudo-triple threat with Dreamer. As for Taz, the early part of 1999 was used to end an old feud, seemingly once and for all. Late the previous year, Taz voluntarily lost the FTW belt to Sabu, willing to sacrifice the unofficial title to take aim at the real one. But after capturing the genuine article, he decided to challenge Sabu to a unification match at March's Living Dangerously. In the accepted coda to their rivalry of several years, Taz defeated Sabu to unify the belts, after which he shook his peer's hand. Another returning act earned a little less respect, especially after their angle didn't follow its design. The week after Guilty as Charged, Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge of the Public Enemy made their return to ECW after 3 years away, and immediately set upon battling the Dudley Boys to determine the company's all-time greatest duo. It began simply enough when Rock and Grunge beat down the tie-dyed brethren in Philadelphia that January, setting the stage for a big match to take place down the line. That match would never come to pass after what transpired the following week in Detroit. To continue the ante-up process of the new feud, the Dudleys got one over on Rock and Grunge, leaving them laying after a beatdown at a TV taping. Suddenly, to the Dudleys' consternation, Grunge began no-selling the beating, prompting a swift reprisal. The cycle repeated once again, this time with a little more malice. With tensions backstage, Rock and Grunge then signed with the WWF, where a reported unprofessional display there resulted in Bradshaw and Farouk of the Acolytes harshly stiffing them in a weekend TV match. But even if Public Enemy had stuck around, they likely would have had to face the same problem as the rest of the locker room: money woes. In February, the Wrestling Observer newsletter reported that wrestlers and security staffers had received checks that subsequently bounced. Meanwhile, some syndicated TV outlets received bad checks, and this resulted in crucial cancellations. Talents were notified by Heyman in late January that because of an ongoing business deal, not all checks were going to immediately clear. And even after those rounds of checks eventually cleared, some wrestlers still reported that they were owed large amounts of money. In the late winter, ECW managed to secure a loan of $750,000 to handle some of the short-term issues. They also set up a deal with Buena Vista Television to handle the upfront costs for pay-per-views, marketing, and advertising, which would take some of the strain off of ECW's bank account. It's believed that had these deals not gone down, ECW was in grave danger of folding in the coming days or weeks. One wrestler wasn't going to be hanging around during the uncertainty: Douglas. Following months of myriad issues with Heyman, the franchise was fixing to depart ECW for the second time, taking his leave after May's Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view after putting over Credible. But rather than work the card, Douglas quit a day early, choosing to instead appear at an indie supercard in Philly that Saturday night. There, Douglas publicly buried Heyman while noting ECW's financial distress and murky future. Hardcore Heaven went on otherwise, highlighted by a brilliant television title match between Van Dam and Jerry Lynn. For 27 minutes, the dexterous athletes put on an enthralling show, which somehow maintained its high quality even after Lynn suffered a nasty facial injury on a bump to the arena floor. The match was the peak of an uneven event that featured lots of substitutions and impromptu matches, proving that even in chaotic times, ECW's strongest links could still come through with premium action. Fortunately, some presumably good news followed in the weeks after Hardcore Heaven. By late May, the news sites were reporting that ECW had struck a deal to air on cable channel TNN, known as the Paramount Network at the time of this recording. By the end of June, the rumor was confirmed that ECW would premiere a 1-hour Friday night broadcast in August, giving the ailing promotion its first national TV outlet. In addition to the company's long-standing syndicated program, Hardcore TV, ECW would have 2 hours every week to put together storylines and entice an audience already feasting on a dizzying boom period for the sport. The good news continued for ECW when they inked a deal with Acclaim to produce forthcoming video game titles, following the expiration of Acclaim's license with the WWF that autumn. Add in the short-lived Company magazine, and ECW, despite its litany of difficulties, was starting to feel like a big deal. But before long, some familiar problems would kick up once more. In this case, roster changes that couldn't have come at a worse time. 1 month before the TNN premiere, the word was out that the Dudley Boys would be leaving for the WWF. The crowd-inciting, table-breaking brothers Bubba Ray and Devon wanted to stay with ECW, but Heyman balked at giving them even the subtly incremental raise they'd asked for. On their final night in Queens, the Dudleys shocked everybody by defeating Balls Mahoney and Spike Dudley to win their 8th set of tag team titles. After promising to hand-deliver the belts to Vince McMahon, they took part in one last bout. At first, the match was just the Dudleys facing company defender Dreamer in a handicap match to see if he could save the belts himself. But in the closing scene, Raven, who had just secured a release from WCW days earlier, slid into the ring and DDT'd Bubba, pinning him at the same time an oblivious Dreamer pinned Devon. The win gave Dreamer his first belt in ECW's Extreme era, but it came with the dejection of realizing that he would have to team with his returning arch-nemesis to defend those belts. The national TV era was beginning with a hot and unexpected storyline. A day after the surprise union of Dreamer and Raven, ECW had its maiden broadcast on TNN. Though instead of opening with fresh content, the program's first episode was a primer episode, a sort of introduction to fans that may have been discovering ECW for the first time. The first TNN broadcast included the Van Dam vs. Lynn match from Hardcore Heaven in full, as well as video packages for several top stars. This confused a number of eager viewers who were anticipating a hotter start. Already, there were problems between Heyman and TNN. The network reportedly turned down the first tape Heyman sent in, so what actually aired on August 27th was a thrown-together replacement, partially sewn together out of early spite. ECW was also obliged to handle its own production costs, without much in the way of help from TNN. ECW also received less advertising time in comparison to other TNN shows, and wasn't doing a good enough rating to justify the ads that were being sold for the time slot. So overall, a rocky start. To make matters worse, just days after losing the Dudleys to New York, world champion Taz, who had been featured prominently on that TNN premiere, signed a deal with the WWF as well. Taz had initially agreed to a 3-year deal to remain with ECW, but disagreements with Heyman led to the reigning champion reaching out to the WWF. Little more than a week after ECW premiered on TNN, Taz agreed to jump ship, though he wasn't slated to begin with Vince McMahon until after the new year. In the meantime, there was the matter of what to do with the ECW belt. Taz had been champion since January and had been presented as indomitable. He was scheduled to wrestle Masato Tanaka at Anarchy Rules in just 2 weeks' time, but Tanaka was only a part-timer, not working the full ECW schedule. Heyman couldn't really have Tanaka win, but he also didn't want to put Taz over with his leaving being widely known. Fortunately, a solution presented itself in the form of a returning figure. In front of a new company record 6,000 fans at Chicago's Odeum, to the tune of a $200,000 gate, another high mark, Anarchy Rules turned out to be ECW's strongest and most memorable card of 1999. After a sturdy undercard that saw Storm defeat Lynn and Credible cleanly beat Sabu, Taz vs Tanaka went on 5th of 7 matches. As expected, the crowd incessantly booed Taz on arrival, chanting "You sold out" at the man still wearing the company's championship. Before the match could officially begin, Mike Awesome, who had been absent for a year due to severe knee injuries, turned up in the front row, ostensibly to confront rival Tanaka. A fierce-minded Taz invited him into the match, and it was his undoing. The champ was pinned by both opponents in 2 minutes, leaving Awesome and Tanaka to vie for the belt. After a prolonged, weapons-laden struggle, Awesome prevailed, winning a championship nobody realized until 20 minutes earlier that he was in contention for. After the match, Taz earned back some of the crowd's love by handing Awesome the belt and endorsing him as champion. Regaining Awesome was a big development, but it came with the loss of another part of ECW's core. Meanwhile, ECW continued to struggle with putting on a coherent contemporary wrestling product on TNN and wasn't exactly building an audience. Certainly, it didn't help that the WWF, through their Attitude Makeover, was doing a glitzier version of classic ECW. And on TNN, a sleazy tabloid feature on downtrodden Tammy Sitch earned heavy criticism, while several weeks were spent on pay-per-view recaps instead of actual story advancement. In the meantime, with WCW in major downsize mode following front office shakeups, a few ECW alums suddenly hit the free agent market. One of them, Whipwreck, turned up at the start of the October 23rd ECW Arena show, where he was crushed by Awesome. Another cast-off made a far greater impact that night. Just as Credible and Storm were about to win the tag belts from Dreamer and Raven following an assist from young upstart Rhino, the lights in the arena went out. After anxious seconds passed by, a solitary spotlight shone into the building's corner, where standing stoically on a perch was a returning Sandman. Amid one of the loudest crowd reactions in ECW history, Metallica blared, beers were spilled, and a Singapore cane was swung at so many heels. In such uncertain times, re-enter Sandman was a needed feel-good moment. The changes continued. Candido, Sitch, and Axel Rotten were all let go that December due to their personal issues. Taz finished up at November to Remember the previous month, jobbing to RVD on his way out. With the loss of so many upper-card names, Heyman worked to elevate the hard-working lower tier. Dojo graduates Danny Doring, Roadkill, and Chris Chetty occupied undercards with a more seriously pushed Nova and Little Guido, as well as obnoxious heels Steve Corino and Simon Diamond, along with the promising Rhino, his sorta manager, the slimy Don Cyrus Callis, and bright-eyed valet Dawn Marie. Heyman was hoping somebody could emerge from this pack. In the main event tier, Heyman booked 2 world title changes to close out 1999. After Awesome spent the autumn battering everybody put before him, he was done in by Tanaka in Nashville the week before Christmas. Just 6 nights later, Awesome regained the title after pinning Tanaka with a reverse top rope sit-out Awesome bomb that more than lived up to the awesome part of the name. Entering 2000, Awesome and Van Dam were the Y2K compliant singles champions, and they were set on a collision course. Van Dam outlasted Sabu in a TV title match at Guilty as Charged, while Awesome turned Spike Dudley into a human crash dummy in their title bout. And at the ECW arena 6 nights later, Van Dam and Awesome sized up to each other for the first time, exchanging heated words. It was a matter of when, not if, that Van Dam, the primary cover star of ECW's upcoming Hardcore Revolution video game, would finally graduate to the ECW World title, dethroning Awesome after a feud of some considerable length. But 2 weeks later, the dream match was deferred. While wrestling Rhino at a house show in Florida, Van Dam broke his lower leg after his foot embedded in the canvas on an attempted baseball slide. Van Dam was scheduled to pin Awesome in a tag team main event at March's Living Dangerously, but was now expected to miss a few months of action. In the meantime, on March 4th, 23 months to the day he became television champion, RVD vacated the belt. 8 nights later, Super Crazy pinned Rhino in a tournament final to become champion. While RVD was sidelined, his rival and tag team partner left the company altogether. Sabu and Heyman had issues off and on for some time, and they came to a head on the night that Van Dam abdicated the television title. Sabu's issues with Heyman's booking, as well as the common gripe about money, led to him walking out before he could put over Super Crazy in the tournament's quarterfinal. While quitting was irksome enough for Heyman, Sabu's next move doubled the animosity. Sabu quickly jumped to California's XPW, owned by adult film producer Rob Black. Black had previously had loose affiliation with ECW and had even offered to help promote a West Coast tour for Heyman's group. But around the time he secured the TNN deal, Heyman disassociated his company from Black. In response, Black formed XPW as a rival on the opposite coast, and gradually signed up a number of ECW alums. Sabu followed the parade into the Golden State, causing Heyman to file suit over alleged breach of contract. Heyman had also sent XPW a cease and desist regarding them using Extreme in their name, different spelling or not. And Heyman had other problems, one of which nearly resulted in a death in the middle of a pay-per-view. At the 3rd annual Living Dangerously, New Jack continued his regular feud with the Baldies, taking on the rotund but deceptively agile Vic Grimes. At one juncture, the two brawlers fought to the back of the arena where they ascended a very narrow piece of scaffolding while some tables were set up below. The original plan was for both men to fall from the perch, hit the tables, and do a double stretcher job. Grimly, the gurneys became necessary when the spot went awry. Reportedly due to Grimes getting cold feet at the last second, the timing was messed up, as New Jack went off the scaffold and Grimes followed way too late. This caused New Jack to break the tables with his feet while 350-pound Grimes landed on him like a boulder, smashing his head into the arena floor. Blood and brain fluid oozed from New Jack's head as the show ground to a halt. New Jack miraculously survived but suffered blindness in one eye from the landing. New Jack would amazingly return to the ring the following month, but around the time of his comeback, another major problem emerged. Reigning world champion Mike Awesome quit the promotion and subsequently appeared on WCW Nitro. Like the others, Awesome was sick of not getting paid and began making a deal to jump to a company with more resources. After no-showing several ECW events in April, Awesome attacked Kevin Nash on the April 10th Nitro. To get Awesome to appear, WCW had to buy out his ECW deal and promised to send him back to lose the belt properly. There was also one other term that WCW apparently reneged on. ECW wanted WCW announcers to make clear the forthcoming date and city where Awesome would make that one-night return to put the next champion over. They didn't do that to Heyman's satisfaction, so more litigation commenced in which ECW gained the sole right to determine exactly how Awesome lost the belt. While one would suspect Heyman to put over a new rising star in this scenario, he decided on a much more unusual plan. Heyman secretly reached out to the WWF and procured the temporary services of Taz for this plan. After Awesome entered through the crowd due to having scorching heat in the locker room in Indianapolis for the Thursday night house show, Taz's WWF theme then blared throughout the small venue, to the delight and shock of all. Taz then hit the ring for an all-too-brief encounter which Dreamer briefly intruded upon, and mere seconds later, Taz choked out his larger opponent to become two-time ECW champion. After Taz with a second Z did the job for WWF champ Triple H at a Philadelphia SmackDown taping, the surrogate title holder returned for one more night to the ECW arena, where he lost the belt in a quick match to Dreamer, the ultimate ECW loyalist. Following a tearful victory speech, Dreamer was attacked by Credible, who then selfishly abdicated the tag titles held by he and supposedly injured Impact player's partner Lance Storm. Credible then beat Dreamer for the world title in an impromptu match after Francine double-crossed the new champ. Credible went on to defeat now rival Storm at May's Hardcore Heaven, which was Storm's last ECW match before following Awesome to WCW, again due to issues with pay. The TV situation was the next pressing issue, and it was a doozy. That June, a court ruled that the WWF and Viacom, TNN's parent company, had right of first refusal over the WWF's TV contracts, defeating USA Network. The WWF announced it was moving all of its cable programming to Viacom-owned networks in the autumn, including transporting Raw is War to TNN. This all but spelled the end of ECW on the channel, though the WWF agreed to give ECW a grace period to stay on TNN while they sought a new national outlet. In the wake of the court decision, Heyman cut a blistering broadside on the TNN program, lambasting the network for their handling of the business relationship. In response, TNN muted Heyman's diatribe and ran a crawl that spoke condescendingly of Heyman's mental state. Meanwhile, morale continued to bottom out in the ECW locker room, between more missed payments and the sobering reality of ECW's future. Heyman even started missing TV tapings, delegating production to top staffers like Dreamer, while he apparently began attending meetings to secure a new TV deal. Despite all the troubles, ECW pushed their westward expansion to California, booking Los Angeles' Grand Olympic Auditorium for their annual Heatwave pay-per-view. While a mostly solid show, Heatwave went down in history as the night that representatives from XPW created a stir at ringside, leading to a greater altercation outside. Just before the main event between Credible and Dreamer, security intervened on a situation between Francine and a group of XPW talents sitting front row. Many wrestlers flooded out of the locker room to get involved in whatever was going on, while security dragged the XPW contingent from the building. Once outside the auditorium, a large number of ECW performers, reportedly including a furious Heyman, trounced a number of XPW staff members in the parking lot before the entire group from the rival promotion managed to flee the scene. No arrests were made, and despite owner Rob Black issuing legal threats on an ensuing XPW broadcast, nothing ever materialized. Some encouragement came in the form of a two-night taping at New York's Hammerstein Ballroom at the end of August. Night 1 was dedicated to a 12-team tournament to crown new tag team champions, as the belts had been vacant since April following Credible's hasty disowning of them. In the end, the new champions were the unusual team of Mikey Whipwreck and Yoshihiro Tajiri, now playing a pair of devilish oddballs managed by the Sinister Minister, aka Father James Mitchell. A night later, the duo dropped the belts to Little Guido and Tony Mamaluke of the FBI, after an excellent match. That second night saw ambitious attempts at creating new stars. After over a year of playing an antagonistic traditionalist and winning a feud with middle-aged Dusty Rhodes, Steve Corino continued an earnest babyface turn, standing up to Credible and challenging for his belt. In the main event, risk-taking veteran Kid Cash won the television title from the nearly unbeatable Rhino, after a chaotic match that featured a ton of run-ins, police presence, and a crazy flipping dive from Cash that took out 24 individuals. It was ECW's most positively newsworthy weekend in seemingly ages. But the good vibes didn't last. Further missed payments and cancelled shows continued biting into morale. Despite the WWF's willingness to allow ECW to remain on TNN for the foreseeable future, TNN was not so inclined and cancelled Heyman's program shortly after the October 6th broadcast, airing only 2 shows past the WWF's arrival. Heyman still hadn't landed a new home for ECW, and a tenuous belief that the now wrestling-free USA network might want in on the company gradually dissipated. The world title changed hands twice more over the coming months. Lynn won the belt from Credible at Anarchy Rules in his Twin Cities home, while Corino captured it 5 weeks later at November to Remember, defeating Lynn, Credible, and Sandman in a 4-way match. With star power dimming, ECW scored a curious coup when they brought in Scott Hall for a weekend of shows, though the bad guy never actually appeared on ECW television. Rhino regained the TV title from Cash, while homegrown's Danny Doring and Roadkill won the tag titles from the FBI at December's massacre on 34th Street. Offsetting the big moments were the painful realities. Van Dam finished from ECW in October to film a movie in Thailand, but there was a more underlying issue keeping him away: owed money. And by December, stories had emerged that Van Dam asked for his release from the company. Around the same time, Lynn tried to leave as well, with Heyman even going so far as reaching out to the WWF to see if they had any interest in his recent world champion. New Jack quit in December, leaving just Dreamer as the only wrestler that had continuously been there since 1995. A special show in Queens that featured one-night returns for the Dudleys and Taz, as well as Holiday Hell at the ECW arena the following week, were quaint, but also underlined just how drastically things had turned for the company in such a short period of time. An attempt to sell a piece of the company to Smashing Pumpkins frontman Billy Corgan went by the wayside, while Hardcore TV began falling apart. Main syndicates stopped receiving new tapes as 2000 came to an end, resulting in cancellations in Philly and New York. ECW was a shambling zombie by the time they reached Guilty as Charged on January 7, 2001. Heyman announced a major surprise for the event, which most fans took to believe was the announcement of a new TV show or new ownership. Instead, it was the return of RVD after his recent impasse, which honestly felt like a letdown given the hype. In an impromptu main event, Van Dam defeated old rival Lynn, who had resorted to wearing someone else's tights after not bringing his gear and refusing to wrestle until Heyman fronted him some of his back pay. The rest of the night was a passable pay-per-view that reeked of doom. The world title changed hands twice as Sandman beat Corino and Credible in a 3-way ladder match before jobbing the belt to the television champion Rhino in another unscheduled match. Rhino didn't even have the TV belt on him because it had reportedly been stolen at the Queen's show the previous month. The Man-Beast noted its absence by disavowing the title, pointing out that ECW didn't even have television. ECW staged just 2 more events, both of them taking place the following weekend in Missouri and Arkansas. Half of the fed-up roster didn't even appear, making for some rather unusual matches. The final ever ECW match saw Sandman beat Credible, after which Dreamer led the remnants of the locker room to the ring for a collective drink. The final toast came in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, before a scattered crowd that chanted "Please come back" as the ECW crew tearfully gave what they knew was the likely farewell. With no more dates set on the horizon, ECW went dark. The Living Dangerously pay-per-view, tentatively scheduled for March 11th, was quietly pulled from providers' calendars. Earlier that month, Heyman showed up in the WWF as heel announcer, replacing the estranged Jerry Lawler. Lynn, Rhino, Credible, and Spike had all signed with the WWF as well. Heyman had reportedly never told his roster that ECW was closing up shop, and let the Optimists put the pieces together themselves when they saw him sitting next to Jim Ross on Monday, March 5th. The following month, ECW officially filed for bankruptcy, about $7.5 million in debt, with so many talents and partners owed substantial amounts of money. ECW was given a brief jumpstart as part of the ill-fated invasion angle that summer, as Van Dam, Dreamer, Storm, and Awesome joined some of the already signed WWF wrestlers, with Heyman leading his old charges. Others rekindled the ECW spirit in other promotions, with 2003 TNA in particular trying to recapture some of that old flavor with New Jack, Sandman, Raven, and Sabu, among others. Following the release of the excellent Rise and Fall of ECW on DVD in 2004, the now WWE produced ECW One Night Stand the following year. Booked by Heyman and Dreamer, One Night Stand was a charming reunion show that hit on many desirable parts of company history. A second One Night Stand in 2006 preceded the launch of the WWE-helmed ECW brand that, though it survived to 2010, really died before 2006 was over. ECW has been paid tribute in other aspects and promotions since then, long after its official demise in 2001. Through reunions, tributes, and attempts at revival, what has remained clear is that ECW cannot be duplicated. Playing the same notes doesn't create the same music. The tenor of the early 90s led to ECW becoming the ECW we all know best, an alternative to a stale wrestling landscape. The mood of the period dictated a need for anarchy, rebellion, and a rejection of conformity, which ECW provided in a way that no wrestling promotion ever had before. The core roster was so unconventional, and many of them could only have succeeded in a place like ECW. What ECW was cannot be consciously duplicated. It has to be a reaction to a growing mood, a yearning for a niche that just isn't being filled. The idealized product for the fan that craved something different, but wouldn't exactly know what that something different was until they saw it firsthand. Despite the many flaws and dings and dents, ECW was the home team for the anti-establishment, and the company was fueled by the high spirits of those who believed along those lines. Today, decades after the real ECW last held a show, its influence remains evident. Bloodshed, weaponry, worked shoot promos, proudly displaying the evolution of in-ring wrestling, letting cast-offs from the big time reinvent themselves in their own way, challenging the ways that pro wrestling has long been done to death. Whether it's a nationally televised promotion or another indie with a cult following, they all borrow from ECW, whether consciously or not. The so-termed hardcore revolution didn't appear to have died with ECW in 2001, as it still finds other ways to endure. To watch ECW today may not give the full context of why the promotion was so special, but to see today's professional wrestling at its best is to see why ECW was so important. For better or worse, the promotion that began in a Philadelphia sports bar remains palpably felt in every wrestling venue on the planet.